Between 800 and 200 BC, something happened. In China, Confucius was teaching the rectification of names and the obligations of social order. In northern India, the Buddha was articulating the Four Noble Truths and the path to enlightenment through the cessation of suffering. In Persia, Zoroaster was declaring a cosmic struggle between truth and the lie. In Israel, the prophets were announcing that God cared more about justice than ritual. In Greece, Socrates was questioning every assumption and insisting the unexamined life was not worth living. These traditions arose independently. They had no contact with one another, and yet they share something: an inward turn, a discovery that the most important questions are not about the gods or the harvest, but about how one should live, what one can know, and what lies beyond the visible world. Karl Jaspers called this the Axial Age and argued it was the hinge on which human consciousness turned. Most of the world still thinks in categories these traditions established. The motion before us tonight asks whether this simultaneity is the most extraordinary coincidence in intellectual history, or evidence of something we do not yet understand. At the table, three thinkers: the empiricist, who will ask what we actually know versus what we have assumed, and whether the pattern survives contact with the archaeological and textual record; the geographer, who looks for the material conditions, the trade routes, the iron, the surplus grain, that make certain kinds of thinking possible in certain places at certain times; and the essayist, who watches for the recurring patterns in how human beings respond when old certainties fail, and wonders whether 800 BC and 2026 might be closer than we think. What is at stake is not just ancient history. If there was an axial age, if human consciousness did turn on a hinge 28 centuries ago, then we are still inside the room it opened. And if another such turn is possible, or happening, we would need to know what the first one looked like, and whether we are the kind of people who could see it. The empiricist will open.
The first question is whether the pattern exists at all. Jaspers identified 5 regions, but the dating is suspiciously elastic. He gives himself 500 years to work with, 8 centuries if you count the margins. In a window that wide, almost any civilization that achieved a certain administrative complexity will have produced someone we can retrospectively call a breakthrough thinker. The Mississippian culture in North America was constructing Cahokia, a city larger than contemporary London, between 600 and 1400 AD, developing sophisticated cosmological thought, organizing priestly hierarchies. We do not call them axial because the oral traditions that carried their philosophy did not survive European contact. The pattern may be an artifact of which cultures produced durable, written records and which colonial encounters decided to preserve them. Second problem, the independence claim does not survive contact with archaeology. By 500 BC, the Persian Empire connected the eastern Mediterranean to the Indus Valley. Trade routes existed. The Achaemenids moved ideas as efficiently as they moved grain. We know Greek mercenaries fought in Persian armies. We know Indian merchants reached the Levant. The absence of documented intellectual exchange is not evidence of actual isolation. It is evidence of what kinds of records we kept. Goods move, and when people move, concepts move. Third, the supposed simultaneity becomes less impressive when you look at what actually happened and when. The earliest Upanishads, where the Indian inward turn arguably begins, date to roughly 700 BC. Deuteronomy, which represents the Hebrew prophetic revolution, was likely compiled around 620 BC. Heraclitus was active around 500 BC. These are not simultaneous. They are separated by as much time as separates the French Revolution from the First World War. We are grouping them because 6 centuries look small on a graph that spans 10,000 years of human history. Now, what would a genuine axial mystery look like? It would be this: Identical philosophical moves appearing in genuinely isolated regions within a generation, not 6 centuries. The calculus was invented independently by Newton in England and Leibniz in Germany within a decade. That simultaneity is interesting because the window is narrow, and we can document that they were working on the same mathematical problems created by the same prior discoveries. The so-called Axial Age gives us 600 years and a connected landmass. The null hypothesis is sufficient. As states consolidated, as bronze gave way to iron and agricultural surplus deepened, as administrative bureaucracies created classes of men with time to think rather than labor, people started asking second-order questions about the stories they had inherited. That is what humans do when material conditions permit it, not revelation.
The empiricist is correct to be suspicious of long time frames and to point towards the movement of goods and ideas. His null hypothesis, that surplus and literacy lead inevitably to philosophy, is elegant. It is also insufficient. It fails to explain the specific character of the thought that emerged. Empires with surplus grain and literate classes have existed at many times and in many places. They usually produce epics about warrior kings and hymns to the city gods. They do not, as a rule, produce searing critiques of power, portable ethics for the dispossessed, and a conception of an inner life that is more real than the state. Something else was at work. The missing variable is the novel experience of large-scale impersonal violence. What was new in the first millennium BC was not iron or grain, but the crushing administrative power of the first true empires. The Neo-Assyrian state, which perfected mass deportation as an instrument of policy from the 9th century onward, is the crucial antecedent. This wasn't just conquest. It was the systematic annihilation of local worlds, the deliberate breaking of the link between a people, their land, and their gods. Consider the city of Samaria in 722 BC, and a craftsman we might call Eli, a sandal maker, not a scribe, not a priest. His cosmos is intensely local, the rhythm of the market day, the particular hill shrine where the rains are petitioned, the guild of his trade whose rights go back to his grandfather's grandfather. The Assyrian army of Sargon II does not merely defeat him, it dismantles his world with bureaucratic thoroughness. He is registered, numbered, and relocated to the highlands of Media, 3 months' march to the northeast, to be resettled among Arameans and Elamites who share neither his tongue nor his god. Everything that gave his beliefs their meaning, the specific valley, the ancestral tomb, the festival calendar tied to local harvest, is now inaccessible and irrelevant. His god, understood until now as the protector of that particular ridge of limestone hills, has either been defeated by Asher or simply does not reach this far. The old answers are not just wrong, they are meaningless. The question he must now ask is not one born of leisure. It is born of terror. What is left when everything you knew has been taken away? That is the question that drives the axial turn. The answer must be a God who is not tied to a place, an ethic that is portable, a truth that can be found inside oneself because the world outside has become unbearable. The thought is not a luxury of empire. It is a reaction to the trauma of empire.
Both the empiricist and the geographer treat the axial age as a problem of external conditions, either insufficient isolation or the shock of empire, while sharing the quieter premise that such intellectual turns occur only when material or political thresholds are crossed. That premise leaves unexamined the simpler pattern. Whenever large populations lose confidence in inherited public frameworks, they turn inward in measurable numbers, regardless of whether iron is new or states are collapsing. The data now shows the same shift. In the United States and Western Europe, formal membership in historic religious bodies has declined by roughly a quarter since the late 1990s, while annual sales of books on ethics, psychology, and personal philosophy have risen steadily. At the same time, participation in structured self-examination practices, weekly therapy sessions, structured journaling groups, and secular meditation programs has moved from niche to mainstream, with millions adopting these habits without institutional sponsorship. These are not leisure activities. They are responses to the same condition the axial thinkers confronted: public narratives that no longer organize daily conduct or answer the question of how to live once older authorities lose force. The recurrence matters. Similar inward movements appear in 4th century Alexandria, when Stoic and Neoplatonist schools drew educated Romans and Egyptians alike into private programs of moral training after the civic gods of the old city-states had ceased to compel belief, and again in early Edo Japan, when Tokugawa consolidation rendered aristocratic warrior codes ceremonially hollow and a new merchant class reached instead for personal devotional practice and popular Buddhist self-cultivation. In each case, the trigger was not a single empire's violence, but a wider loss of fit between received stories and lived scale. The coincidence of dates between 800 and 200 BC therefore looks less like accident or hidden contact than like the ordinary rhythm of societies that have outgrown their first-order explanations and must invent second-order ones. What millions are choosing to do today, leaving inherited institutions while building private disciplines of attention, suggests the mechanism is still operating and does not require an unprecedented historical hinge to explain it. You stated that the null hypothesis is sufficient. Literacy spread, empires grew, surplus increased, and people started asking second-order questions about the stories they had inherited. If that mechanism alone explains the pattern, what accounts for the absence of comparable inward turns among the literate priestly classes of the late Bronze Age Hittite or Kassite kingdoms, where administrative surpluses and scribal traditions were already entrenched for centuries without producing portable ethics or self-scrutiny on the same scale?
The question is good, and the counterexample is sharp. You have caught me claiming that surplus plus literacy equals philosophy as though it were a deterministic law, when I should have said it is a necessary but not sufficient condition. The Hittite archives contain palace inventories and treaty texts. They do not contain metaphysics. That is the difference between record-keeping elites and a reading public. What changed in the first millennium was not surplus, but the distribution of literacy beyond temple and palace scribes. Alphabetic writing in the Levant, simplified scripts in China during the spring and autumn period, these technologies allowed merchant classes, provincial administrators, and eventually anyone with modest means to read and write. The Hittites had literacy. They did not have a literate laity. Philosophy requires an audience that can argue back. The question you should be asking yourself: if the mechanism is still operating, why has the current inward turn produced no thinker of remotely comparable influence to those five? Therapy is not the analects. You claim the missing variable is the crushing administrative power of the first true empires, and specifically the novel experience of large-scale impersonal violence. Yet the Roman Republic's centuries of near-continuous warfare, the Samnite Wars, the Punic conflicts, the grinding devastation of the social war, produced Stoicism and eventually Neoplatonism, traditions that oscillated between civic engagement and mystical withdrawal without ever settling definitively on either. If trauma of imperial violence is the mechanism, why did Roman thought produce Marcus Aurelius writing on duty from a military campaign tent at the same moment Plotinus was teaching escape from the material world entirely? You have two thinkers, 1 century apart, responding to the same empire's violence with diametrically opposite orientations, one perfecting the self within the world, one seeking liberation from it. What determines which direction a civilization tilts? Until you can specify that variable with precision, imperial violence is not an explanation. It is a label attached after the fact to whichever outcome needs accounting for.
The empiricist is right to press this point. Why does one culture look at centuries of bloodshed and produce a theory of good government, while another produces a theory of radical escape? And you have caught me in an oversimplification. The trigger is not violence as a single category. It is the specific political geography of that violence. The wars of the spring and autumn period were, for all their horror, a contest to inherit a known world. The prize was the unification of a coherent cultural space. It was a crisis of succession. The Neo-Babylonian project in the Levant was entirely different. It was a strategy of deliberate de-development. When Nebuchadnezzar's army destroyed Jerusalem in 587 BC, they didn't simply defeat an army. They leveled the city walls, yes, but they also burned the temple, which was the state archive, the land registry, and the national bank, and deported the very scribal and artisan classes needed to rebuild it. The goal was to remove Judah from the map as a functioning economic and political entity. The question for a Chinese thinker is, how do we best organize the state? The question for a Judean scribe in Babylon is, what are we now that our state is a ruin 1,000 miles away? The first question leads to social ethics. The second, by necessity, leads to transcendence. So while you are correct about the spread of literacy, the crucial variable is what the emergency forced people to write. One system produced policy papers. The other produced psalms of exile. They are not the same thing. You argue that when a society's public stories fail, its people turn inward to build private systems of meaning. You point to the rise of therapy in the modern West, but consider the city of Magnitogorsk in the years after 1991. The collapse of the Soviet framework there was absolute, a far greater loss of fit than anything we are now experiencing. The response was not a great inward turn towards self-cultivation. It was a demographic collapse driven by alcoholism and despair. Is the inward turn a universal response to crisis, or is it a luxury of a gentle decline?
The question exposes a real limit. In the post-Mongol destruction of Baghdad's scholarly infrastructure after 1258, the rupture was total, stripping away both institutions and the practical continuity of written transmission, and the result was indeed demographic retreat rather than disciplined introspection. Where no residual apparatus of reading and argument survives, the inward response simply does not appear. Yet the same century produced, among the remaining educated strata of Andalusian exile communities in North Africa, a documented surge in private philosophical circles and Hebrew-language journals of ethics and self-scrutiny, even as displacement and political fragmentation destroyed public order. The difference was not gentleness of decline, but the survival of one narrow channel through which older habits of second-order questioning could still be practiced.
You have been arguing about conditions, literacy rates, trade routes, the violence of empires, the survival of reading classes, as though the interesting question were why do these moments happen? But the thing none of you have named is this. If an axial age is the moment when a civilization's operating system gets rewritten, when the questions people ask and the place they look for answers fundamentally change, then the real test is not whether we can explain the first one. It is whether we would recognize the second one while standing inside it. We are in 2026. Institutional religion continues its decades-long collapse across the developed world. Artificial intelligence is being asked ethical questions its creators cannot answer. The nation-state is losing its monopoly on both violence and meaning. Millions are conducting daily experiments in how to live that have no institutional address. So, are we inside an axial turn right now, or merely inside a crisis that will restore the previous equilibrium? And if we are inside one, would we know? Or does the thing that defines an axial age include the fact that the people living through it cannot yet see what is being built, only what is coming apart?
The question of whether we would recognize such a turn is the correct one, because we are looking for it in the wrong place. We are listening for debates in salons and universities. An axial shift doesn't begin where the old system is comfortable. It begins where the old map is a lie. Consider Musa, a man in his 30s who lives near what used to be the Nigerian shore of Lake Chad. His grandfather was a fisherman. His father was a fisherman. He was meant to be a fisherman, but the lake, which has lost something like 90% of its surface area since the 1960s, is now a day's walk from his village. The state is a rumor. The global economy, which burned the carbon that evaporated his world, is an abstraction. All the inherited knowledge, the cosmology, is broken. The proverbs his father taught him about the currents are now descriptions of a ghost. The seasonal calendar is meaningless. The question is not, as it might be for us, what is a good life? The question is, what is a world? When the physical reality that underwrote your entire system of meaning vanishes, what do you build in its place? Musa and the men like him are not turning inward to write philosophies of the self. They are turning outward, creating new networks. They are piecing together new lives from smuggling, from micro-trade, from allegiance to new prophets and militias who offer a map that works. These new systems of trust, value, and violence are being built right now. at the edge of the world's attention. We would not call it philosophy. We would call it a security problem, but a new set of answers to the question of how to live, forged in a place where the old answers became fatal, is the very definition of an axial turn. We simply are not accustomed to the new prophets arriving on motorcycles.
The geographer's portrait of displaced cosmology registers the collapse of inherited knowledge but treats the resulting activity as an external scramble for new maps. Aggregate behavior shows something narrower and more durable: the quiet multiplication of private accounting practices that detach value from any single ruined place. Across the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, household surveys record a measurable rise in the use of rotating credit associations and handwritten transaction ledgers kept by individuals who have lost access to both state registries and ancestral fields. These ledgers travel with migrants. They record obligations that no longer rest on land tenure or seasonal calendars. The same pattern appears in the sudden uptake of basic mobile money accounts wherever coverage reaches communities whose livelihoods have been severed by conflict or desertification. What looks like outward improvisation is in fact the spread of portable, verifiable memory that can survive the loss of any fixed geography. A comparable shift occurred among Armenian merchant communities displaced by the Ottoman Safavid Wars of the 16th century. Expelled from their trading hub at Julfa in 1604 and forcibly resettled, these merchants did not rebuild fixed entrepôts. Instead, they developed a system of personal commenda contracts recorded in small traveling notebooks, obligations denominated not in land or royal favor, but in portable reputation and witnessed debt. Those notebooks did not restore the prior order. They created a new one in which credit and standing could be carried across political wreckage. Within 2 generations, the practice had standardized into the new Julfa network, whose agents operated from Amsterdam to Manila on the strength of ledger-borne trust alone. The single case of the motorcycle prophet therefore understates the scale. What the data track is not the emergence of charismatic authority alone, but the diffusion, across hundreds of thousands of ordinary households, of the minimal technology required to keep promises when every inherited assurance has been removed. That diffusion is the behavioral signature of an axial adjustment already underway, whether or not it produces a named philosopher.
The essayist claims that private accounting practices spreading among displaced populations are the behavioral signature of an axial adjustment already underway. The geographer shows us communities whose inherited cosmologies have become ghost stories. Both treat adaptation to crisis as though it were automatically transformation. What we know from evolutionary biology suggests otherwise. Consider the Permian-Triassic boundary 252 million years ago. 96% of marine species went extinct. What survived? Mostly disaster taxa, small, generalist organisms that could tolerate low oxygen and high temperatures. These thrived for several million years. Then they disappeared. They were crisis specialists, sources, not the future. The actual diversification that reshaped marine ecosystems came much later, from lineages that had survived through the disaster taxa period but were not themselves disaster adaptations. The informal lending networks the essayist describes may be disaster taxa. They solve the immediate problem of keeping promises when older institutions fail. That does not make them a new foundation. The difference, disaster adaptations scale horizontally. They spread because they work right now. Transformations scale vertically. They become the infrastructure on which new problems can be posed. Here is a useful comparison. After the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC, linear B script disappeared entirely with the palatial economies it served. What emerged was not a refined version of palace bookkeeping. The Phoenician alphabet that eventually filled the gap was structurally unrecognizable to any Bronze Age scribe, built on different assumptions about who records things, why, and for whom. That was transformation. The emergency grain tallies scratched onto potsherds in the interim centuries were not. They were coping. They left no descendants. The test the geographer's portrait requires is precisely this. Take the peer-lending circles now documented among climate-displaced communities across the Sahel. Do their grandchildren use a modified version of the same instrument, patched and updated? That is continuity through crisis. Or do they use a system their grandparents would not recognize, built on assumptions about value and obligation that emerged because those circles existed but are not themselves about surviving displacement? That would be transformation. We have no evidence yet for the second pattern. What we have is exactly what the fossil record shows after mass extinctions: a rapid bloom of coping mechanisms, most of which leave no descendants. The Cambrian explosion, the actual diversification event that gave us body plans still in use, 500 million years later, came only shortly after the Ediacaran extinction cleared the field, with the two events separated by less than 1 million years. If we are in an axial moment, we are in the 50 million year part. The disaster taxa are everywhere. The new phyla, if they exist, are invisible. The question is not whether people are adapting. They always adapt. The question is whether anyone is building something that will still be legible when the crisis is over.
Most adaptations to broken frameworks remain temporary workarounds that solve today's coordination problem and then fade. The sharper signal is the quiet spread of citizen assemblies chosen by lot in place of elected bodies. In Ireland and France, governments have moved from pilot experiments to assemblies whose recommendations informed referendums on abortion rights, same-sex marriage, and climate targets, while Aiken and other localities have piloted more permanent sortition structures, with advocates now pressing to embed the random selection method into standing procedures rather than treat it as an emergency measure. These assemblies do not restore the old representative system. They replace one of its core assumptions about who may legitimately decide. That replacement is the vertical step the fossil record rarely records. Consider the difference between a city that builds higher flood barriers and one that relocates its population to different ground entirely. The first preserves the existing settlement pattern under greater stress, while the second abandons the premise that the settlement belongs where it is. Disaster adaptations multiply through the first logic because they are cheap to copy, a practice that alters the default unit of legitimate authority scales through the second. It forces every subsequent institution to justify itself against a new standard. Whether these assemblies survive the next election cycle or the next fiscal crisis remains open. What is already visible is that the questions they pose about representation no longer require the prior institutions to exist first.
The empiricist is looking for a new phylum in the fossil record. The essayist sees it in the assembly. Both are looking for a system that scales up, but a genuine shift might not look like a new form of growth. It might look like the orderly, deliberate abandonment of growth as a principle. Consider a woman named Katrin in Hoyerswerda, a city in eastern Germany built to serve a vast coal mining complex. After 1990, the mines closed and the city began to empty. Katrin has spent the last 20 years watching the state methodically deconstruct her world, not in a panicked retreat, but as a matter of policy. The apartment blocks where her friends lived are gone. The school she attended was demolished in 2007. What is being replaced here is not a coping mechanism scaled up into something more robust, and it is not new infrastructure laid over old foundations. It is the foundational promise itself that is being revoked, that an industrial city is a permanent thing, that the future will be larger than the past. The new operating system being installed here is not about building a new kind of legitimacy. It is about managing finitude. It asks a question that is illegible to the old framework. What is the half-life of a city? This is not an adaptation to crisis. It is a philosophy for a world that has begun to shrink, being written not in texts, but with wrecking balls and carefully landscaped parks where buildings once stood. The most profound transformations are not always additions. Sometimes they are subtractions.
The geographer's Hoyerswerda account did not change my thinking, but the absence of any comparable documented precedent did. I claimed we lack evidence for transformation as distinct from coping. That claim assumes transformation leaves a signature we would recognize. But every axial case we have was reconstructed centuries later from texts written by people who did not know they were founding anything. What changed? I now suspect the empirical standard I have been applying may be inappropriate to the phenomenon. We demand legibility during the event, but the first Upanishadic writers were not announcing a new age. They were solving a local problem about ritual efficacy. The Hebrew prophets were addressing the Israelite people, not posterity. The signature of an axial turn may be precisely that participants believe they are doing something minor, repairing a broken system, maintaining continuity, solving today's problem, while accidentally building the categories that will organize thought for a millennium. The test is not whether anyone now is constructing a grand system. It is whether a sufficient number of small, local, apparently pragmatic solutions are converging on the same implicit ontology. That convergence would not be visible to those inside it, and we have no method for detecting it in real time. Consider what this means for historical analogy. The early makers of double-entry bookkeeping in 14th century Tuscany were solving a merchant's problem about tracking debt across multiple currencies. They were not laying the cognitive infrastructure for capitalism, the nation-state's fiscal apparatus, and the audit culture that now governs institutional life. But that is what they did. The test we need is not one that identifies architects who know they are building. The question we did not ask, if an axial age requires that its architects not know what they are building, then any claim that we are inside one is self-refuting. We would only know by being wrong. Is there a coherent epistemology for a process that becomes invisible the moment you name it?